Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and Ramadan Kareem, especially to our colleagues in Kabul. It's very nice, well, to not see you all, but to go. We went through the participant list, and we're very excited to see a lot of familiar names and faces, also project partners of FAS and friends. Welcome on behalf of FAS to our distinguished speakers, Minister Nadari, Rector Mogherini, to Andrew Watkins and Timur Sharon, who have joined us on this project 9 months ago. I counted today, so quite a while. And especially to our chair and good friend, Orzala Nemat, from the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit, who will chair our discussion today. And she also represents the Afghanistan Policy Group today here, a group of distinguished and eminent civil society leaders and policy thinkers and practitioners that FAS is working with, especially on these kind of questions that we want to discuss today, for almost a decade, and we're really excited that she's here with us. I want to give a special shout out before moving to the actual project, to the people behind me who also joined us today, the members of the Young Leaders Forum that FAS Afghanistan is running since 2004, working with youth. Their passion for the future of their country is something that motivates and inspires us every day, especially in these difficult times, to also think about the future. And the project that we want to discuss today, the questions that we address, are very much future oriented. So welcome to everyone. Let me say a few words about the work of FAS. The Friedrich Ebert Foundation is working in Afghanistan since 2002. We have been working with a large number of civil society activists, stakeholders in government, but also in the region, to work on questions on social justice, economic well-being and inclusion, decent work, the economic foundation of the well-being of Afghan people. We also work on capacity building and questions of good governance that we equally see as still important for the future of this country. And we hold dialogue events on peace and security, basically from day one, both addressing local and national conflict issues, but also this whole question of a regional dialogue and how it can be basically instrumentalized to move forward in creating a stable and secure Afghanistan for everyone. It is in this line that we thought last year after the Doha agreement that the uncertainty coming out from the agreement was just unbearable for us. We didn't really know how to move forward in such a situation. What would it mean? A lot of focus was on the policy of the United States, which was mostly a mysterium for many observers, especially observers also in Europe, but also in the region. In the project that we proceeded with, Uncertainty to Strategy, that Andrew and Timur joined us with in September, we wanted to do an environmental scan and find out what do the neighbors actually think about scenarios that could come up with. Are they nervous? Are they optimistic? Are they positive? What is behind the slogans that we get from the capitals? What is the narrative behind the meetings that we see, the discussions on Twitter, the official statements? So we went literally through our regional network and visited regional capitals and had engagements with thinkers, with practitioners to find out what is their forward thinking. And we decided to bring Europe and the European Union in especially because behind this transatlantic alliance that brought us to Afghanistan is also a story that for Europe, there is a lot at stake in the Afghanistan peace process. It does matter to us. It matters to our security. It matters to our international relations, to our interest in this key region. It's not something that we can sit back and let others do the thinking. So this is why we established a trilateral format that also connects basically interaction between the people who make the decision, who need the information, who have to engage also in a new thinking. A final point that was of our interest, and I will then keep it to Andrew and Timur also to tell more a bit about the publications that came out of it, and especially our final report, was that how can we create a benefit between the initiatives that we see from the European Union and Europeans to engage regional states. There are bilateral initiatives, there are strategic dialogues, and bring and squeeze and nudge Afghanistan into these initiatives to create win-win scenarios and amplify the need for coordination, and also exploit in a way the interest that many regional states have in good relations with the European Union and finding especially a common ground on this. So these were the questions that we embarked on. We had the honor to have more than 150 officials, practitioners, academics from more than 10 countries with us. We got a lot of open doors, also with Minister Naderi and his colleagues. We're very thankful to all the stakeholders to engage, to be open, to also discuss critical questions with us. We published profiles of these trilateral engagements, and I encourage you to read them and pass them on in English and also in the local language. And today we basically reached the end of this journey for now, but our hope is, of course, to actually kickstart a discussion with these recommendations that Andrew and Timur will present to us, with the input that we get from our keynote speakers on what now can be done while we wait for a scenario to unfold. What can be our active role, both from Europe, but also from Afghanistan, to exploit the potential that our relations have, to embark on maybe a new journey, but make use of platforms that exist and could be much more used for the mutual benefit. With this, let me thank you everyone again for joining, for bringing your smart, bright minds to this discussion, raise questions, discuss with us. We're really looking forward to this. And with this, I'll hand over to Ursula and to look forward to a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. Good evening, good day, good morning to all participants. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to chair today's panel, which is happening in a very timely period as we speak. We are honored to have our distinguished speakers here to discuss the new paper that in analysis titled Neighbors Abhor a Vacuum, the Future of Regional and Key Partner Engagements in Afghanistan. As Magdalena mentioned, the issue of regional connectivity is of crucial importance in Afghanistan, particularly now following the formal statements from the US president about the very fixed time for the US troops or international military forces withdrawal from Afghanistan. Within the context of current situation, I think Afghanistan definitely needs a proactive regional diplomacy in order to avoid, we all talk a lot in the case of Afghanistan and lessons learned from the past and not repeating the situation of early 90s or several other occasions. We really need to take proactive actions. And I think today's discussion, I hope that by the end of it, we will be in a stronger place where to begin. And if we are already beginning, we hope to hear about it and how to be careful to use this opportunity between now and the date of the full international military withdrawal to make sure that our region is working in a more cooperative way rather than working behind the back of the country and playing the kind of destructive role as in some instances we have practically experienced that in the past. So we have seen, Magdalena, you were talking about, why Europe is important here. One example that comes to my mind is 2016, the massive migration flows from Afghanistan when the story or the narrative of collapse was dominating the news and everyone's mind in Kabul. So we saw that people took the risk for their lives to arrive to Europe. If we know from that experience that if such thing is repeated, we will face probably the same because people will be ready to take the risk for their lives and get drowned in waters of Turkey to reach to Europe. So definitely Europe's role here is important. for themselves to be in a stronger position supporting us. And how I'm connecting this 2016 story is that I remember very well what really was a triggering point in terms of changing that narrative. The president of Afghanistan, using the regional connectivity and the regional projects, have contributed to some extent in at least changing the narratives. We know not lots has happened. We know maybe a lot of it was PR and publicity and all of that, but somehow that reliance on building stronger regional diplomacy has helped to give some level of confidence to people. At least it's a very rough, observation I wanted to share in this context. And that brings me to the point of, the current context and the importance of now doing this very strong proactive regional diplomacy, not necessarily through intra-governmental relations, but even beyond that. So we hope and desire that the Afghan civil society, FES and Afghan Policy Group is a great example of trying to connect, different policy groups together in order to build those bridges. Because what we need for a real peace and a lasting peace and a sustainable peace in Afghanistan is to have those mutual and respectful relations with our neighbors, near or far neighbors. So without further ado, probably I'm here to chair, so I will not exploit my time to keep on speaking. I have a couple of housekeeping notes before I introduce our distinguished speakers and keynote speakers and panelists. One is that we all have to remind all the audience that this is this event is live broadcasted through Facebook. So if you have any comments or questions, please use the comments below the video link to share it with us. At the same time, at the end of the event today, we are going to have opportunity for questions and answer. Please use the chat box to post your questions and mention if your question is posing to a specific distinguished panelist. We make sure to get as many of your questions being responded as possible within the time frame. So let me introduce the distinguished keynote speakers and panelists of today. We have with us His Excellency Minister Nadri. Said Sadat Mansour Nadri is a member of negotiation team of the Afghanistan Islamic Republic and the State Ministry for Peace. Mr. Nadri has been a member of a cabinet of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan between 2015 and 2018 as the Minister of Urban Development and Housing. In the socio-culture sector, he has also served as director of Aga Khan National Consulate for Afghanistan and one of the supporters of charitable activities and strengthening sports and institutions. We also are extremely honored to have Madam Federica Mogherini, who is director of College of Europe since September 2020. Madam Mogherini co-chairs the United Nations High-Level Panel on Internal Displacement since January 2020. Previously, she has served as High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission between 2014 and 2019. We also have with us the two authors of the report and distinguished researchers working on Afghanistan. Andrew Watkins is a crisis group senior analyst for Afghanistan. He focuses on the prospects and challenges for peace process in Afghanistan and then the Afghan conflict. Before joining crisis group, Andrew worked inter alia as a political affairs officer for the UNAMA or United Nations mission in Afghanistan. Last but not least, we have Dr. Timur Sharon with us. Dr. Sharon is the founder and executive director of Afghanistan Policy Lab. He has over a decade of professional experience specializing on subnational governance reform, program development and management, and strategic policy and analysis and advocacy work in Afghanistan. He was formerly Deputy Minister for Policy and Program at the Independent Directorate of Local Governance. And before that, he was a senior analyst for Afghanistan at ICG or International Crisis Group. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor, or the virtual floor, I would say, to Excellency Minister Nadri. The floor is yours, Minister.
Thank you, Ms. Nemat. It is a pleasure to be amongst all of you. Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to you all. I'm glad to be talking to you all today, especially along with Ms. Federica Mogherini. Thanks also to Frederick Ebert Stifton, FES, for convening these discussions that have been very helpful in thinking about the external dimensions of peace and stability in Afghanistan. I had the chance to review the report and was particularly drawn by its emphasis on the need for new regional frameworks of cooperation and its very specific recommendations for European stakeholders. Before I talk about the region, let me briefly touch upon where things stand in the process right now. With the withdrawal announcement from Washington, there is a lot of speculation about what will happen next. Many entertain the worst case scenarios, a Taliban military takeover or a chaotic civil war. Those are, of course, the easiest ones to imagine and with the highest capacity for media sensation. But such scenarios become more likely if more people believe in their inevitability. With now the definitive exit of international troops, the Taliban's claim of fighting an external force has lost all its credibility. That is why they try to set a new narrative of fear-mongering that the Afghan state would fracture in the face of their military power, all trying to pressure the collective social psyche into surrendering to them. So I am cautioning us all not to fall in their trap and not to play into that narrative. What I would ask is to engage our political imagination in thinking about other possibilities within our reach, short of a civil war, of a future that could be more delicate than a linear trajectory towards state collapse. Our history has shown that state structures have been more resilient in the face of military forces. What we need right now, not only to carry on with the peace process, but also as a security guarantee, is political unity and commitment. So I think it is a collective moral responsibility of us all to give people assurance, to show that we are up to the task. They want an immediate end to the bloodshed. They have grievances from injustice and corruption, but that does not mean they will accept a regressive emirate. They have the resilience and the commitment. All they look for is someone to speak to that resilience and commitment, to appeal to them. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, the withdrawal of forces presents risks. Yes, a deeper and prolonged conflict here will create dangers beyond Afghanistan's borders in the form of a more conducive environment for international terrorism and a potential refugee exodus. More importantly, it could undermine the foundations of a democratic and pluralistic Afghanistan, which could be a loss for Europe, as stood for and invested in strengthening these values. Before Europe, America, or even our neighbors, there will be a threat to Afghans. Violence has already been unacceptably high. nearly 9,000 civilians have been killed since last year. There, however, are also opportunities presented by the troops' withdrawal. A major one is the new space for more constructive role of the regional actors with regard to Afghanistan. Regional policies towards Afghanistan have for decades been a reaction to American policies. Some stakeholders have not been delighted with the presence of American and NATO troops. At the same time, they have acutely been worried about an unstable Afghanistan that could have spillover impacts for them. The exit of international military forces provides a space where a more homegrown and long-term regional understanding can be developed. The significance of stability in Afghanistan for regional connectivity and prosperity is almost a conventional wisdom. The question is how to materialize that. One available space to forge such an understanding is the Afghan peace process. It is time for regional players to step up in defining a new regional equilibrium around Afghanistan, one that fosters conducive environment for cooperation. More genuine cooperative behavior is needed from regional actors to turn the peace process to a success. When it comes to security, the nature of that threat is constantly changing. Such a dynamic threat environment requires agile solutions and equally dynamic platforms for collective action and resource contribution. There is a natural alliance between regional extremist groups who also pursue political ideologies within national borders, international terrorist organizations who need a safe space to mobilize, train, and coordinate, and criminal networks who provide financial support for these two in exchange for the protection of their illicit activities, including drug trafficking. Regional stability is threatened by this entire nexus, combating, which requires concerted regional efforts in intelligence sharing, border patrol, and other aspects of security cooperation. To forge such an environment, it will require, first and foremost, a collective agreement on the role and position of Afghanistan in the region. We know who we want to be, a stable and democratic country that contributes to the regional prosperity, that is an integral part of regional connectivity, that enjoys friendly and cooperative relationship with all our neighbors. That vision, however, requires the buy-in of the region. All stakeholders must conclude that the best way to serve their interests is to contribute to a stable Afghanistan through supporting the peace process. It is true that regional rivalries have cost Afghans heavily, but it is also true that such competitive regional ecosystem has also exposed vulnerabilities and posed threats to regional stakeholders. That has to change. We have tried to solidify such regional consensus. We, in the Afghan peace structure and our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, try to bring the region together, to engage in genuine and honest conversation with all about their concerns and to explore opportunities. In recent days, I have met 5 regional ambassadors to discuss our common vision for the future. There, however, remains a lot to be done. Some major old geostrategic calculations must change. That is where we continue to need the support of our international allies and partners. The United States military influence in the process will decrease, but it will continue to hold leverage given its financial commitment and political engagement. It is important to have a wider approach, multilateral efforts through already existing platforms of engagement, including regional and international organizations, as well as thinking of international financial transactions and trade and economic relationships as tools could be positive complementary to bilateral diplomatic engagement. More specifically, the United States and NATO should work with the region to communicate the implications of the military withdrawal from the region, the space it provides for other actors to step up, and the need for those efforts to be positive and cooperative. They should also communicate their political and financial support for the Islamic Republic and its security and defense forces in order to maintain public confidence in national institutions. Finally, the withdrawal of international troops opens the space for Afghans to own their share of the problem. But this problem is as much a regional one as it is an Afghan. It is time to chime in with solutions, not with problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency Minister Naderi. Rector Mogherini, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and let me thank you personally, the Foundation, the Minister, for this insight, and I think it is really important to hear from Kabul first, but also I'd like to thank Andrew and Timur for the report. I've carefully read it, and I think that it contains excellent analysis, but also excellent recommendations, in particular for the European Union and its member states on the way forward. And maybe I'll say a few words about that now or in the conversation that will follow. I could not agree more with the Minister on everything he has said, and in particular, the need to guarantee that this moment that can be indeed a turning point, first of all, is not dramatized by ourselves, because others will try to dramatize it enough. And also that we try to keep our blood cold and mind focused and lucid, and try to, rather than entering into the discussion of whether this is right, wrong, the timing, the way, try to focus collectively, first of all, on hearing the Afghan needs and focusing on what our Afghan partners and friends, and if I may, brothers and sisters, are worried about at this stage, and what kind of solutions they envisage on a very practical level from now onwards, because every single week will count in the preparation of what comes next. So first, that we listen to what Kabul has to say, that we support our partners in Afghanistan, that we practice that respect for ownership that we always preach for. Sometimes we always advocate for, at least in the European Union, we always preach for an Afghan-owned and Afghan-led process, but we have hardly seen any Afghan-led process or Afghan-owned process. And I think this can be the moment, especially for Europeans, to say, okay, if not now, when? It's the Afghans that need to take the lead in defining what they need from the international community in order to do damage control. Sorry if I will be a bit realistic and pragmatic, but I think do damage control, avoid the worst from happening. And I agree with the Minister. I think the most dramatic scenarios might not be the most realistic ones. Afghanistan has a long experience of surviving through crisis in different ways. But a prolonged crisis can also be disruptive. And so I think that as we take this damage control approach, we also need to carefully look at how we preserve the positive steps that had been built in the past and that are not irrelevant. I think that Here I can speak for myself, but also still for the European Union, even if I don't represent anybody here, in saying that in the case of Afghanistan, as in no other case in the world or in history, the role of women in society and in these particular months will be the key point to consider to see if damage is done or not. Because this has been the indicator somehow of success in the last years and decades. And I think that this will be the main point that not only the international community or Europe, but also the Afghan people themselves will look at on a daily basis. What kind of place, role in society, in the political process, in the peace process, even in security, can women and girls have in education? So how do we avoid the worst scenario? First, listen to the Afghans, put the Afghan ownership and leadership at the center of it. I'm sure that my Afghan friends would say, well, easy to put us in the lead in the most difficult moments of the conflicts. But you know, there's nobody better than you can sort it out. Because you know your country, you know your people, and you know your region. So I think that if there were some mistakes done in the past, was they were linked actually to a lack of listening to the Afghan voices enough, and a lack of understanding of what was happening really on the ground. So first, listening to what the Afghan considerations are and needs from the international community are, trying to support the Afghan leadership and the Afghan ownership of any step that is taken from now on, trying to support, as the minister was mentioning, the Afghan achievements. And again, I highlight the role of women and girls in different sectors, but also trying to support the Afghan achievements and consolidate them through a continued support from the international community, for instance, to the Afghan security forces. The fact that there will be a withdrawal, military withdrawal of international troops, on which I might elaborate further afterwards, but doesn't mean that the international support to the Afghan security forces disappear. On the contrary, I think it should even intensify, because it's in the moment when the Afghan forces will have to take the lead in guaranteeing security on the ground. So paradoxically, or not much so, the moment when the troops will leave, the more the international support to the Afghan troops will be needed, and all forms of security forces. So I think it is very important that that's not only the public message, but also the practice, the concrete daily practice of the international partners of Afghanistan, and starting from Europeans, but also the United States, that withdrawal of troops does not coincide or does not hint to a withdrawal of interest, of support. It shouldn't at all be the case. On the contrary, the less troops on the ground, the more support to the Afghans in the country. That would be my plea, my approach, and I think we're going to leave quite a critical juncture, not only for the Afghan people, first and foremost for the Afghan people, obviously, and again for the Afghan civil society, for the Afghan women, even more so than from all other Afghans. And we've seen that dramatically with the rise of killings in these last months. It's never a coincidence. When the killings increase, it's always in parallel with the peace process. It's a way of changing cards on the table as you speak. It's always the same dynamic we've seen in many different conflicts. So first, also protecting the Afghan players that can bring change to Afghanistan. And then obviously trying to support, to open the space, to support, make it feasible, a different kind of regional dynamics, which is the key element here of our discussion today. If you look at the geography of Afghanistan, you easily understand that there is no way you can make Afghanistan peaceful and successful without the neighbors and the region contributing to that. And there is no way the region can be stable and safe without Afghanistan being safe and stable because of the geographical borders. And I think that the regional players, actually, I think we have to make a distinction here between the neighbors, strictly speaking, and the regional powers. If you look at the neighbors, actually, I think they're very much aware of the fact that they have a role to play. Some play it, Some played in a less constructive manner that we would have expected them or hoped them to play. But I think the neighbors are very much aware of the influence, the power they have, and the influence and the power that the Afghan situation has on their own internal situation. I think the regional framework is slightly different. I think in the region there are powers and even superpowers that see an opportunity, see a potential source of problem, but can easily survive and prosper without Afghanistan being safe and prosperous, while the neighbors cannot really do it. So I think that here we have somehow two circles to look at. The neighbors as such, and I think that indeed there is a need to, as the reports say, encourage and even incentivize the neighbors to do no harm first, and secondly, to see if they can contribute positively to safeguard a political space for an Afghan peace process. And I underline here an Afghan peace process, because so far the peace process has been a peace process, but not necessarily an Afghan peace process, if I can put it this way. So encourage the neighbors and even incentivize the neighbors with also the leverage that some players can have, like the European Union that has plenty of leverages on the neighbors, all of them. I think the European Union is the only player in the world that has not only open channels, but also open leverages with all the neighbors of Afghanistan, none excluded, and can use it to, again, have them refraining from doing harm, having them contributing to stability and peace, having them reaching out to their interlocutors inside Afghanistan, respecting sovereignty and independence, but still exercising a sort of soft pressure on the connections they have inside the country to at their turn incentivize and encourage dialogue and engagement on a serious basis for dialogue. And in the framework of the constitution that Afghanistan has. I would like to underline this because sometimes we forget Afghanistan has a constitution that needs to be respected until there is a new one in place, unless and until there is a new one in place. I think that the European Union can definitely have a role in this respect, in terms of, first of all, offering its own experience. It's different, it's a completely different setup, obviously, but the Europeans know what it means to turn from a continent or a region of conflict and crisis and wars into a region of integration and cooperation from an economic and even now political perspective. But take the economic side, at least, the connectivity side. I always bring the example of the beginning of the European Union. I know this can sound surreal in Afghanistan today, but it sounded surreal also in France and Germany 75 years ago, when actually we started with a community on steel and coal, something extremely concrete and practical and limited in scope. And what was the purpose of that? That purpose was to make sure that former enemies, countries and peoples that were enemies till the very first day before, sharing an economic interest, were not put in the condition of fighting each other anymore, because fighting each other would have been contradictory to their own economic interests. So the idea of the European integration in the very first place was to create economic and connectivity links so strong that it would have been counterproductive to go back to war again. And I think that, again, in a completely changed environment, this basic principle of a region sharing economic interests, connectivity interests, resources interests, you name it. Afghanistan shares interest with each and every of its neighbors, and vice versa, because of the nature of geography of the area. If you get to a point where you manage to share enough economic interests to make it counterproductive for yourself, as the minister was saying, against my own interests, to go in a place of destabilization and conflict, that is the only trigger to peace and stability. I'm not so much afraid of this because it can work. It can work if you show that joint shared interests that the players in the region can have. I believe that the European Union has a role to play, and European countries have a role to play here, not only in sharing this logic and experience, but also in offering incentives. I've discussed at length with the Afghan authorities in the previous capacity the potential incentives that the European Union can put on the table to accompany a process of transition, of reconciliation even in Afghanistan, because at a certain moment, a peace agreement is not something you sign on paper. First, obviously, you have to get there. But then what happens the day after is sometimes the most dramatic moment. So what do you do to reunite the country, to re-include people? What do you do with the former combatants? What do you do with the families? All of this is something on which Europe has an experience, has instruments and money to offer. And I think this could be, I know this sounds now very far away in time, but the best way to prepare the future is to start talking about that and putting on the paper some tracks, some ideas that you can actually turn into real projects. So I think there is a space. It's not an easy space, I think, to be. I'm not particularly optimistic, as I'm not seeing the dark picture also as an impossible to escape scenario. I'm also not particularly optimistic at this stage, but I think there can be good things that can be done. And I think it is extremely important to involve in this exercise. First, if I could rank, first the Afghans, starting from women and civil society. Second, neighbors. And here I think that the Central Asian countries have a particularly important and neglected so far role to play. I noticed that the envoys of or Afghanistan of the European Union and Central Asian countries have released a joint statement a few days ago. I take it as an important message of coordination and unity, not to be underestimated at all, because it's family, because it's there are links across the borders, and then the region and the broader international community in support of an Afghan-led, region-centered and internationally backed road to sharing interests to try and share also the interests of security and peace.
Thank you very much, Rector Mogherini, for excellent remarks, especially with what you ended, I think is the most important beginning of our next panel, a regional, central, internationally backed solution for Afghanistan with putting the voices of Afghans on first. So at this stage, we will go to hear from both our authors of the report. Andrew, are you going first? And then maybe Dr. Sharon. Andrew, please.
Thank you, Dr. Nemat, and thanks to Magdalena and to FES Afghanistan, first of all, for putting this project on and for inviting us to become involved. It's really been an enriching and learning experience for me, and I think for all of us. Thanks very much to Rector Mogherini and His Excellency Minister Naderi for joining us and spending the time, not only on the panel, but on the report as well. I want to talk about some of the main themes in the report very briefly in a way that hopefully opens them up for questions and discussion among ourselves. We started the report, I think, with the most obvious and what felt like the catalyst to so much of what is happening today, which was a creeping trend that we observed, led by the United States, but also with signs from many other countries and entities, a trajectory of disengagement. For a long time, I think many of us, even close observers, would have said that this was led by a particular political figure, that this may have been the policy aim of a single president of the United States. And we see today, especially in the last few weeks, that there really is something else going on here. Definitely with ties to US domestic politics, but also in our discussion with a range of European officials and other donor states to Afghanistan, there is a sense of fatigue in some cases, impatience in others, among donors and supporters of the Afghan state. And it really seems to have been, to use a terrible phrase that's used too often to speak about Afghanistan, to have turned a corner and that there is a shift in mood among Afghanistan supporters. Hopefully this does not presage a disengagement of all support to Afghanistan, as our panelists have noted, but it has certainly pushed a trend of disengagement in terms of security assistance and what that security assistance will look like in scope, if not in scale. This has led to something of a domino effect, and we see this in the tensions of the United States-NATO relationship and perhaps transatlantic relationships more broadly. There is a great deal of frustration among many European states about not only the manner in which the United States has approached its own internal path towards disengagement, a military disengagement in Afghanistan, but also the practical reality and the obligation that NATO and other troop contributing nations, they will have to follow. And this is something that we tried to explore and to ask ourselves what the possibilities were for similar levels or a similar type of military and security assistance from other contributing nations. And our conclusion was the umbrella provided by the United States military, the infrastructure that exists, really is a necessary requirement for NATO to mount a large-scale support and assistance mission. And so this will change. This doesn't necessarily mean that things will change for the worse, again, as has already been said today, but it will be changing. With disengagement already in motion, this led us to a chief question about the future political and security vacuum that will be left behind by the United States and some of these other contributing nations. I want to make a note, this is not to over-prioritize questions of security over those of governance or of human rights and social conditions or even economic growth. All of those, when we look at international engagement with Afghanistan post-2021, are incredibly important, obviously to Afghans most of all. What we wanted to do in looking at the question in this way is to acknowledge how dependent so many other aspects of development are on a baseline of political stability and of a stability indeed in the security environment. And so looking at the way that neighboring states and regional powers think about political and security stability will inform us better on what their longer term thinking is in so many other areas of engagement. One of our first big observations was there is widespread reluctance to intervene on the same scale that the United States and NATO have in terms of the security context from any of the neighboring or regional states. There are certainly interests at play, some of them existential, as Rector Mogherini said, for neighboring states in particular, but there is not a willingness or a capacity or both among any regional powers to intervene in the same way in terms of direct troop intervention. What this means is that there will be support, there will be assistance, there is even the potential for interference, but this will be on a smaller scale. It will likely be financial and diplomatic in its primary form, and it may very well take the form of proxy interests. As we move through very quickly to just discuss some of the elements of different regional states, with Russia, we were surprised by how exclusively Russian thinkers and officials are focusing on worst case scenarios that might unfold in Afghanistan. And indeed, we were told that since 2014, since the drawdown of the majority of US and NATO troops, there has actually been a shift in Russian thinking, looking at Afghanistan as perhaps already trending 6 years ago towards an inevitable Western disengagement. That's not to say that this was in fact inevitable, but only to say that Russia planned on it being so, and that this has dictated a lot of Russia's behavior ever since then. Central Asia we've already had it mentioned, I think, how underrated a role that Central Asian states can play, and we found a great deal of complexity in their posture towards Afghanistan and engagement in the future. There's often an assumption that Central Asian states will fall in line with Russian interests, given Russia's security umbrella and engagement on all fronts throughout the region. But particularly when it comes to Uzbekistan, we found an almost reverse approach to Afghanistan. From Uzbek officials and thinkers and academics, we didn't hear any consideration of worst case scenarios. In fact, we heard an exclusive focus on optimism, on best case outcomes, and the potential for positive engagement, economic and otherwise. In South Asia, it's going to be very difficult in our assessment to get out, as the minister already noted. There are some neighboring and regional states that will be stuck in zero-sum thinking and calculations, strategic calculations that date back decades, that are going to be difficult to overcome when it comes to looking at Afghanistan, as Afghanistan itself, not as a representation of other threats or interests. When it comes to Iran, there's absolutely the potential for harm, but we also see a historical precedent of prudence. And we don't see Iranian engagement in Afghanistan the same way you see Iran extend its hand in so many other aspects and locations of the Persian Gulf, the Levant, and the wider Middle East. And so we do have the potential for Iran to play a more passive role. With China, it has been much less engaged economically than many have hoped, many in Kabul and throughout the region. In part, this goes back to our understanding the more worrisome the security environment is, the less that regional powers are going to be willing to invest on the scale that we've seen by Western states and Western donors in Afghanistan the last 2 decades. However, we do also see signs of China's willingness to open new ground, proposals of peacekeeping troops, suggestions made within the United Nations framework of how to expand the UN's mission there. China clearly has an interest in its Belt and Road Initiative, of which it would like Afghanistan to play a greater part. And China remains a great unknown, perhaps simply because the potential to intervene and support is near limitless. The bottom line is, it is going to be very difficult and will require strong incentives, but also a strong facilitator to pull these countries out of their instinctive roles, which is going to be to protect their border regions and to do whatever they need necessary to create a buffer zone in the areas around their own borders and to protect their own individual national interests. That is going to be the default role that every neighbor and regional state plays. And without an entity stepping forward and really helping usher and shepherd many of these states towards common interests do exist, but it will require facilitation, active facilitation. And this is where we believe that the EU can step in and play a unique role that even the United States has had difficulty doing. One other issue is the stance of hedging. Magdalena started the session off by talking about the ambiguity, the uncertainty that all of us, Afghans and observers alike, have been left with. Since the signing of the US-Taliban deal in Doha last year, certainly, perhaps that uncertainty is even more amplified today with news of an unconditional US withdrawal. In this time period, we have seen hedging, sitting on the fence of many regional states and neighboring states, waiting to see what happens. A wait-and-see posture has only been strategically wise for many of these states, to see not only what happens with the peace process and with eventual Western presence, but how things play out inside Afghanistan. Fortunately, if there is any positive to the news from the United States withdrawal, it may be that there is a moment of clarity where regional powers and neighboring states may now plan and chart a path forward that does not require a wait-and-see posture that we have seen across the board with all regional powers. Even Washington itself, amid its presidential transition of power, was hedging the debates within its national security establishment, the dialogue that we saw leading up to President Biden's announcement of his decision. And of course, there has been hedging out of survival, out of resilience, and out of looking forward from the Afghan state itself. This is a topic that we want to particularly focus on, and I'll hand over to my colleague Timur in a moment. But we also want to note some of the problems in the EU's stance. The EU has not hedged in the same way that many other regional powers have, but there is, there are questions to be asked about the EU stance of strong rhetorical support, but also strong statements of conditionality. And in speaking with Afghan civil society and Afghan officials, we found that there is a flip side of this coin to strong statements of support, but also strong, strict conditions applied to that support. The worry is, if trends look towards an increasingly challenging environment in Afghanistan, and those conditions are not met, will Afghanistan and all Afghans be held hostage to some parties to the conflict not meeting the EU's conditions? And what does that mean, as strong of support as that may feel in the near term, as perhaps a bargaining chip in the peace process? What does that say for the next 5 or 10 years? And does the EU have clarity on its unwavering support for Afghanistan moving forward? Here we come to some of the conclusions that we drew, which is that new frameworks are needed, or at least serious support provided to those that already exist to revitalize them and push them in new directions. Of course, we have the Heart of Asia Forum, which has widespread engagement, but is also understood to have limited efficacy to date. That doesn't necessarily have to be true moving forward. And as we've identified that strong external facilitation will be needed to bring some of these regional states out of their first instinct, security first policies, the EU has space to engage with all regional powers. It is incredibly strong trading partners with some states playing a strong role, such as Pakistan. The EU also has a less adversarial role than the United States does with Iran or China, even given all the complexity of the relationship with Russia. In many ways, there were always going to be a ceiling on what the United States could do in putting a regional framework together. It doesn't seem that that's true in the same way for the EU, if it has the will and resolve to step into that role. The EU could also step up just in terms of the uncertainty that the United States has left. If there is a confusion or a lack of regional consensus on the conditions that neighboring and regional states wish to put forward in offering their support to Afghanistan, the EU can be a pillar for all other countries to rally around and to discuss common conditions that all nations want to see. An interesting development coming out of the Moscow conference was the Troika Plus statement. I think that surprised many of us in the values that were put on paper and that some regional states would like to see moving forward. That could certainly be something expanded with the EU jumping in and playing a more proactive role. But of course, all of this will require EU states to come to consensus themselves, not just on what they hope to see from Afghanistan in its future, but genuinely what resources they are willing to expend, regardless of the trajectory Afghanistan takes. With this, I'd like to turn it over to Timur, and thank you again all for your time and your engagement.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much, Andrew, for this brilliant summary of the report itself. It's my pleasure to be here and with such a distinguished panel, including Minister Nadri and Rector Mogherini and Dr. Sebor Zalon-Nemat. I'm delighted that this report is out, and I look forward to getting your reviews and comments from colleagues here and elsewhere. Now, Andrew addressed most of the key aspects, arguments of this report, so I'm not going to repeat any of those, but maybe highlight a number of issues. Now, before talking about the Afghan state posturing and where the Afghan state stands in relation to the current regional dynamics in light of the US, NATO and US decision to withdraw from the country, maybe I say a few words to put things into perspective. I think NATO military withdrawal itself presents a number of opportunities for Afghanistan and the region. First, in the last 2 decades, as pointed out by Minister Nadri, Afghanistan's relation with its neighboring countries has been seen through the prism of NATO military presence. Neighboring countries, Iran, Pakistan, India, Russia, have calculated their relationship with Afghanistan, and their calculation has been driven by these dynamics and the presence of US military, NATO military in the country. Now, and since 2014, the US policy in Afghanistan has been driven by timelines, by deadlines, by US erotic and often ambiguous Afghan and counterterrorism policies. It often changed signposts from in terms of its goals and objectives in the country. So it made everyone guessing, both the Afghan state and also its neighboring countries, about its intention, goals, and its medium to long-term commitments. So maybe the decision, the US final, this final decision by the US to withdraw by September, provide itself an opportunity for the Afghan state to redefine, and the region to redefine its interests and relations with each other. Now, because of the heavy US engagement, NATO engagement in the country, the regional voice and the regional framework was missing, often overshadowed by the US and the US relationship with Afghanistan's neighboring countries. That regional framework and mechanism never materialized because US was not, had a strained relationship with Russia, with Iran, and others, and now with China. We see that emerging at the global level. It created a regional framework vacuum that I think now presents itself as an opportunity to maybe the region push for a regional solution to the Afghan issue. And it certainly provides an opportunity for the Afghan state to redefine its relationship with its neighboring countries now that it's out of the US shadow. Now, I'm making this case that this is presenting an opportunity because of a number of reasons, and I think I'm coming across optimistic, being optimistic here, for a number of reasons. One, having talked to the neighboring countries, the key stakeholders for this report, one of the key consensus that emerged was that the region needs to own its problem, the Afghan problem. And then the region needs to take a more proactive actions in this regard. Secondly, there is, for the first time in the last 4.5 decades, we're seeing a serious convergence of interest within the region for the region in terms of economic potentials for economic cooperation, in connectivity, political stability, fighting terrorism, violence, managing borders, and so forth. And this is the first time this convergence of interest is emerging itself. And recent challenges, including the COVID-19 and pandemic, which has disrupted the economies in this part of the world, is itself presents opportunities for cooperation as these countries are facing environmental challenges. Thirdly, there is definitely a reluctance within the region, both in terms, I mean, a lot of people are making comparison to 1990s. What we found out was that it seems to be some sort of a reluctance and lack of resources and energy by the neighboring countries to engage in the kind of proxy war that they engaged in the 1990s and supporting their proxies, creating buffer zones and so forth. They're certainly, as Andrew pointed out, they're hedging they're betting hedging their bets to avoid worst case scenarios in the country. But that does not translate at this stage and in near future to for these countries to engage in some sort of a proxy war in Afghanistan. What we are privately hearing from the Russians, the Chinese, Iranian, and Pakistanis and Indians is that that most of these countries do not want the Taliban they do not want to see an outright victory for the Taliban, and that's a positive sign. But having said that, we are yet to see how the dynamics would unfold in the country. Finally, maybe a few words about where Kabul stands in this regional dynamics. The US withdrawal immediately obviously created some confusion and a feeling of betrayal within elements within the Afghan state and also the Republic side. But I think in the last couple of months and the uncertainty around the peace process and the new administration's policy towards Afghanistan, a lot of Afghan actors, including the administration, has adjusted themselves to the idea that the US will militarily withdraw from Afghanistan. Certainly, President Ghani has accepted the US decision and seems to be adjusting his relationship, its strategy towards both the region and also the US. Kabul has been exploring option for the past couple of months in reaching out to neighboring countries. It has been pursuing a multipolar regional diplomacy, reaching out to Iranians in particular, to the Indians and others within the region to ensure that it builds some sort of consensus and redefines its foreign policy with these countries. Even there was at one point a discussion with Iran about signing a strategic agreement with the Iranians as the US were planning to leave. As the administration is pushing this shuttle diplomacy, there's also this has also been overshadowed, sadly, by a lack of clear strategy and ambiguity about neighboring countries, what to do with neighboring countries, and more importantly, who is the driving institution or body within the Afghan state to push in setting up a regional framework. Is it the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or National Security Councils and others? And finally, this is also overshadowed by the lack of political unity within the Republic side, and partly the president's inability to broaden his political base, to appeal to wider political forces within the country. All of these will have implications in terms of redefining Afghanistan's relationship with neighboring countries, but also neighboring countries' relationship with Afghanistan. If there is a unified voice coming from Kabul, that will make it easier for neighboring countries to directly address and talk to Kabul rather than different actors within the Republic side. So let me end here. Happy to discuss some of the scenarios that we talked about in this report.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sharon, Andrew, for excellent briefing on the report, and your remarks really helped us get an overview of the broader picture at the region. And I think this is very important for our understanding in order to see where we are heading from here. Now is the time for the Q&A. So we are trying, and I hope Magdalena will help me not to miss any questions. So with the permission of our distinguished panelists, I would pose 2-3 questions at once in the interest of time to just save us time. And also I hope any one of you feeling you're welcome to respond them. The first question is from Mr. Jonathan Schroden about the Biden administration hinting about the possibility of moving some counterterrorism capabilities at the regional level. Jonathan is asking whether Uzbekistan could be a possible country where, or any other country in the region could be a possible place for counterterrorism forces through NATO to be stationed. Following to that, there is a question from Ahmad Shakatawazi focusing on two aspects. One, the evidence that shows Taliban safe sanctuaries in Pakistan, and how that could be that could be changed in the context of regional connectivity discussions. So why international community, he asks, is not putting pressure on Pakistan to renounce the violence and their support to insurgents. And second question he has is about the role of UN in terms of monitoring Taliban ties with terrorism. So probably we cover these questions, and then in the next phase I go and share with you the rest. Anyone who wants to go ahead. Andrew, please.
Dr. Nemat, I can take the first question from Dr. Schroden on Uzbekistan. Not being a specialist on Uzbekistan at all, but having spoken to a number of specialists and scholars as we prepared for this report, Uzbekistan is more independent and expresses its independence more boldly from the Russian sphere of influence than most of the other Central Asian states. But there is nonetheless an incredibly delicate balancing act that takes place. And I think to answer and consider this question about Uzbekistan's willingness to offer basing rights or much closer cooperation with the United States military, we have to look back at the conditions in 2005 when Uzbekistan actually, for a very brief window of time, did offer those sort of basing rights and fly over and fly through rights, but then withdrew it based on the developing relationship with Russia and with the regional dynamics that Uzbekistan faced. In the understanding that has been explained to me, those complications, if anything, have only grown thicker. And it would be quite difficult for Uzbekistan to take such a step of direct military cooperation with the United States. And that's not to say that it's impossible, but even the United States congressionally mandated Afghanistan study group itself, when it determined the feasibility of basing rights in any other countries, said that Uzbekistan was not in the possible options.
If I can strengthen this point of view, I think that first of all we have to keep in mind indeed the past, what happened already, not only in Uzbekistan, but even if it's two completely different countries. But keep in mind that there was a presence in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, and it provoked not only the end of that, but also a major political discussion in the country. So indeed, there is an element of sensitivity there. But most of all, I think from what I learned in my conversations with Central Asian countries, and also in particular with the Uzbekistan authorities, I have the impression that Uzbekistan can be indeed a very important regional player, and by regional here I mean one of the most important players, because I think regional players are more important than others in this stage, more in terms of the potentiality of opening negotiating tracks rather than any security one. I think that Uzbekistan is well positioned to facilitate or at least explore some channels for, including back channels for dialogue and negotiations, rather than any security-based work, and for sure not with NATO, I would say. So I fully back what Andrew said, and I think that's indeed where the potential of Uzbekistan lie is more on the possibility to explore diplomatic tracks. And indeed, the president of Uzbekistan tried to explore these channels in the past years, including with all the other regional powers. And I think there is something interesting there to be now reopened in the moment when indeed there is more space for and to my knowledge, Uzbekistan is hosting a conference, a regional conference in the summer on connectivity and regional projects. So I think that it's a well-positioned country because it has links and connections and composition of ethnicity and religion that can help to explore that element of how to get to potential peace talks or agreements using the regional interests on an economic and connectivity basis. I think that is a potential that the country could have, if sufficiently backed by the other Central Asian countries and regional powers, and obviously Afghanistan itself.
Hello. I will try to answer the second question on the sanctuary, as well as I'll have a go on the last one as well. With regards to the Taliban providing safe sanctuary, or the Pakistan providing the Taliban a safe sanctuary, I will separate this question into two parts. Number one, I think since the withdrawal of the troops, the game has shifted. There is a new paradigm now. As the panelists also spoke as well, emphasized on this. I think the biggest question now is that there is no longer any excuse for the Taliban to continue to fight after the troop withdrawal. So all that religious rhetoric about the invaders, the foreigners being in Afghanistan, that after the NATO and the US troop withdrawal will disappear. Therefore, there is no more excuse on that. And secondly, on the regional dimension, there is now clarity that the US troops and the NATO troops are no longer in Afghanistan. So those countries that has been supporting the Taliban has no longer any more excuse under the sphere of the international community to continue to provide sanctuaries to the Taliban. Don't forget about one thing, that since the peace process has started 7 months ago, one thing that has been highlighted clearly, although we have not made a lot of progress with the content of the discussion, but the limelight and the publicity on the peace process, both the Republic sides stands on our values, on especially the values of the Republic values, and the gains that we've made of the 2 decades has been clearly highlighted internationally through media, as well as we now know where the Taliban stands. Although they've made very broad-based statements on certain aspects, but so in this regard, I think
Minister Nadri, we cannot hear you. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me? Hello?
Minister, some of us can hear you, yes.
We can hear you. I think we lost Ursula for a minute. Sorry.
Yeah. So basically, I think that there is a new paradigm. We need to have the continuous fighting. There is no more excuse for that. With regards to the last question, the role of UN monitoring the Taliban's ties to terrorism, I think, first of all, this is the biggest question that most of the papers do not highlight. We need to differentiate between the Taliban fighters and the foreign and the Al-Qaeda, the foreign fighters who are in Afghanistan. With regards to the Taliban fighters, we are in the peace-making phase. Once we reach into the agreement and move into a peace-building phase, we need to have reconciliation of the Taliban forces within the system. But what is the question about the foreign fighters being in Afghanistan? This is where we need to have a clear check and balance, a clear mechanism. I think UN is the right entity for this to A, differentiate between the fighters, and B, to also hold Taliban accountable that they have distanced themselves from the international fighters or some of these basically terrorist organizations. Thank you.
Okay, we have lost a moderator, but I hope I can improvise and pick up a few from the questions from the Q&A and the chat box. But just as a caveat to everybody who asked questions about individual countries, shameless advertisement, Timur and Andrew have produced like really good profiles on that basically answer all your questions, and you can find them on our website. And then maybe we can come back to the threads. If I see from the Q&A and the chat, one question maybe to Andrew and Timur that we also discussed was with conditionality from the neighbors on should there be a Taliban government in Kabul or a Taliban-dominated government in Kabul. You've talked about EU conditionality, and we asked the regional players, what would you actually do? Like, what are red lines? What kind of behavior would you sanction? We had discussions about ceasefire that were not, I think, so optimistic, but maybe you can share a few your thoughts on whether the regional players would actually rein in and under which conditions. Then one question that I would like to take up, and maybe also to Minister Nadri, is the a question that was raised in the chat by Anonymous about the government's institutional challenges to coordinate, because this is also something that I would like to ask you. You spoke very inspiring about the new political imagination and the new momentum, and of course the news yesterday from Istanbul were not necessarily encouraging, but today there was an announcement of a trilateral meeting, and of course Afghanistan has diplomats and an apparatus to steer foreign policy. But we also heard from Timur one observation that there was also a situation where we felt the regional states would basically pick and choose and invite individuals to like give them nice meetings and get their hopes up, but would also use the divisions between different factions in the Afghan politics to basically play everyone on their own fiddle. So how can you actually coordinate within Afghanistan in the institutions, or do you feel there is a bigger boost? And then one final question that I will take from the chat, then I give back to you and hope Ursula will rejoin us now, is to Madame Mogherini, also from Mohammed Hakimi, who raised this question in the chat. And I also wanted to ask you this because of your, well, UN head that you also have on the panel on displacement. Because of course, one reason why the neighbors were so concerned was also the question of this horrible scenario of like mass displacement and Afghans trying to leave Afghanistan and would then go to Iran, go to Pakistan. And we've seen, and Hamid has raised this in his comment, of course there is containment and there are physical measures that neighboring states take to prevent Afghans from seeking refuge or seeking a better life in their areas. And it's not going to get easier for Afghans to find refuge in other countries, let alone the difficult situation they will find if they make it to Iran or to Pakistan. In Europe, when we had heard the announcement of the withdrawal, alarm bells of a second 2015 also rang. So Hamid asks, if basically the region is sealed off for Afghans, would Europeans actually care about Afghans in need, because the risk that they could come to Greek islands is very low? On the other hand, do you see actually engagement by the European Union with these like transit or even like the states that refugees would seek refuge in, Turkey? Do you see a more push for European policy on displacement? Maybe I'll put these questions back on your plate, starting with Andrew and Timur, and then for the next round, Ursula will rejoin us. Thank you.
So Andrew, if that's okay, maybe I'll go first. And maybe put some of the questions together. First of all, in most of these reports that Magdalena talked about, that Andrew and I wrote, we did talk about scenarios from the perspective of each in neighboring countries, near neighboring countries, and international donors. There are three main scenarios that were highlighted in most of these reports. The first one was the survival of the state, that there will be stability, and that is the best case scenario for Afghanistan, but some sort of power sharing agreement in which Taliban will be included within the Afghan state. And that's, I think, everyone's hope and dream at this stage, that we achieve some sort of a power sharing agreement and include them in the future government, so the state survives intact. The second scenario was that the Taliban, that there is stability, but the Taliban take over, or being the dominant force and act as the regime. And with that, significant sacrifices along the human rights, democratization, the loss of significant constitutional rights and basic rights. The third one was the worst case scenario, which is the civil war scenario. Now, hopefully at this stage, what we are hearing is that international community, the Afghan state, the key players within the Afghan Republic itself around the key goals and objectives, as well as the neighboring countries, are advocating for the first option, which is the survival of the state, inclusion of the Taliban in the future government through some sort of a power sharing agreement. So all depends on these three scenarios and how things unfold. Now, with the framework that I presented at this juncture, it seems that we are pushing towards the first, I mean here, international community, neighboring countries, everyone else, for the first option. But there are certain conditions needs to be met, And I think here EU has a role to play, as Andrew pointed out, in terms of helping, if not driving a new regional framework, but helping the region to set up a regional framework in light of the fact that the US will no longer having the leverage to dictate things in Afghanistan. And again, back to the earlier question to Katawaziseb, who asked about US leverage over Pakistan. The truth is, right now, that Americans do not have any significant leverage over Pakistanis, let alone making Pakistanis close sanctuaries, Taliban sanctuaries. They couldn't use efficiently their leverage in 2010-11 when they had over 140,000 troops in Afghanistan. So I think we have passed that stage of asking the US to help putting pressure on Pakistanis to close leverage. I think we are at this juncture, given that the Americans are leaving, the Pakistanis will probably take the credit for defeating the US, helping defeat the US, and we work collectively, the Afghan state, the Republic side, with the neighboring countries to push for a regional settlement, something that will ensure that the interest of regional countries are ensured and presented. Now, the momentum is there because, as I said, for the first time in the last 5 decades, we're seeing a convergence of interest. We're seeing an active, proactive Uzbekistan that is pushing for connectivity. Central Asian countries that were closed, including Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, are pushing for connectivity. Pakistan, we're seeing some signs of change, obviously, in the messaging, but of course we need to see it in action. Iranians definitely cannot see a return of civil war the way they did. But more important, and let me finish it here, I do not think that that for Iranians and the Russians, the idea of a buffer zone will work because it didn't work in the 1990s. They created some sort of a buffer zone, but the Taliban came and took over. So they won't be able to maintain West Afghanistan Iranians or the North for the Russians. They won't be able to do that. That idea of buffer zone doesn't really make sense to them. And I think that's something that they're talking privately. What they have is to work with the Afghan state, with the Republic side, work with the Taliban. I mean, I welcome the Russians' engagement with the Taliban, the Iranian engagement, with Uzbeks' engagement with the Taliban. That is a good sign because ultimately we need to sit down with these people and negotiate. So let me end there and pass it on to my colleague, Andrew.
Let me just jump in because Director Mogherini has to leave us and we're running a bit over time. Andrew, with your permission, I would hand over to Ms. Mogherini so she can share a final thought before we leave her to her important.
Yes, I'm sorry for that, but unfortunately, those that still, I thought that moving from the institutions to the College of Europe, I would have had a lot of free time, but actually it appears that my calendar is not getting any better with time. So I apologize for that. I will have to leave you in a while, but I would like to thank you all for a very, I think, insightful conversation and discussion and very interesting questions. I've looked through the Q&A as well. Indeed, for the refugee issues, I mean, this was at a certain moment, indeed, one of the triggers that provoked, I would say, the political ground for many member states that were traditionally not particularly interested in dealing with Afghanistan as a security or political crisis. The refugee element, the factor of refugees opened the space for getting their attention on the need for Europe to focus on the solution of the situation in Afghanistan and the security there. I would tend to refuse, though, reading the European orientations or positions or policies through the lens of the movement of refugees. I know that some Europeans and in some European countries, this will be the first question put: how many refugees will move, how many refugees will leave, where they will end up. I know this will be in the minds of many decision makers in some European countries. But let me also, as you said, wearing the hat of the UN High-Level Panel on Internal Displacements, let me refuse to take this angle and this lens myself. I refuse as a human being, even before as a politician or an official or formal official, I refuse to look at the Afghan crisis through the lens of how many refugees will arrive in Europe. I think this is a problem for the Afghans more than for the Europeans, including for the potential Afghan refugees, and including also obviously the regional countries and the neighboring countries. All of them know a massive number of Afghan refugees in their own countries. So again, it will be an element of European considerations. It could be an incentive for Europeans to mobilize with support. But personally, I refuse to take this as the key factor to be considered. I think geopolitical and security and political itself elements of the region and of the country are the ones to be considered today. The refugee factor is only one element of that, and indeed is more relevant for the refugees themselves and for the region than for Europe. And again, sorry if I have to leave you before time, but it has been a pleasure to join you, and apologies if I leave you before the end of this interesting discussion.
Thank you so much, Madam Ghani.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for your precious time to spend with us, and we've had really benefited a lot from your insightful comments and the conversation. Thanks a lot. Probably apologize for a technical issue that I had to be signed out in a couple of times. Minister Nadri, probably we could go to you, and then for the final words, we will come to you, Andrew, and then we have to close, I'm afraid, because of the time.
To the question posed towards me. First, we welcome any initiative like the, if you look at the trilateral that's occurring tomorrow in Istanbul, we welcome it. The more regional engagement we have, the better it is. The Troika Declaration was an excellent example of the regional engagement. But in terms of the coordination and unity, first of all, let me make it very clear to you is that we are a democratic country. So we have a very vibrant media, vibrant civil society, and also a vibrant different political parties. We have our differences of views, like any other country around the world. When people ask this question of us and say, you know, the Taliban has unity and you guys, the Republic side, don't have unity, to be very frank with you, I consider this question to be quite unfair, because we are, as I said, we are a democratic country with democratic values. We are accountable to our people. His Excellency the President has been elected in the office. Therefore, whatever we do, you know, people can ask us. Our political parties has their views. However, when it comes to our national interests, we will come together. There is a unity amongst us. We've already proven to you that amongst our negotiation team in Doha. Before we went to Doha, I am also a member of the negotiation team as well. Before we went to Doha, there was a lot of question being raised that the Republic side there was no unity amongst us. But we showed more discipline, more unity, more patience, more commitment towards peace than you know, the other sides. Again, when it comes to the upcoming conference in Istanbul, I can assure you, we've already collected views from the High Council for National Reconciliation members' views with regard to the roadmap for peace. You'll be surprised that the amount of we've already reached consensus over 95% of the key points. On some of the very few issues, I am sure in the upcoming meeting of the High Council for National Reconciliation, we will go to Istanbul with one voice, with unity, because this is historic, this is important. It doesn't get any more critical than this time. Therefore, there will be unity amongst the Republic. We already have our roadmap. We are well prepared for it. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be amongst all of you. I have to depart as well, if you can excuse me. And I was delighted to hear Andrew as well as Dr. Sharon. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency Minister Naderi. Great honor having you here. We know how busy you are with a lot of work. So it has been really a great pleasure having you here and benefiting from your insights and this very important topic. We appreciate and we say goodbye to you. Thanks. Andrew, probably we can have a few words from you to close today's discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Nemat. And thanks to everyone who remains tuned into the discussion. Thanks for all of the questions, many of which are really fantastic. As Magdalena said, I hope that answers or at least exploration of your questions are found in the briefs. And then in the final thematic report, we really try and bring the broader regional picture into focus. I want to briefly pick up on something that Dr. Sharon very, I think, insightfully touched on, which was also included in questions to kind of conclude and close. The idea that what happened in the 1990s and what regional states have done in the past was not even successful then, and so it absolutely should not be repeated today. There was a question about what some of these regional states that are engaged in interventions elsewhere around the world may have learned from their interventions, whether it's in Ukraine or Yemen or Libya or other crisis zones around the world. And I think Afghanistan is different because Afghanistan is in the backyard, so to speak, of so many regional powers and world powers. And what these states have been able to do in terms of proxy warfare, asymmetric warfare, and many other new phases of intervention, they might not view as worth the risk intervening in Afghanistan the same way, in particular because they have a history and not a successful history of attempting to intervene in the past. Finally, maybe we can conclude on the question of how do these states really perceive the Taliban, and what is the conditionality that all of the region's states can agree on. I think it's important to reflect that, particularly when it comes to Russia, China, and Iran, the dismissal of the Taliban is not something to do with the nature of the group itself, or its treatment of Afghans, its human rights stances, or its ideology, but from two major concerns. One is the issue of displacement within the region and the strains that might place on the countries neighboring Afghanistan directly. And number two is the wave of transnational jihadism and the concerns that foreign terrorist groups and cross-border terrorist groups would be able to move freely throughout the region. But then we go back to the hedging that we've tried to describe in our report, in some cases which these nations have undertaken since at least 2014 to speak with the Taliban, not as openly or transparently as the United States has in the past years, but to address exactly these concerns. Iran, or Russia, China have almost certainly for more than 5 years now been informing the Taliban of what their red lines are, what their conditions are. And while those may never become public, it's fairly evident from these countries' interests and their histories what it is that concerns them most. There are bare minimum concerns that everyone shares, and they all come down to some level of political and security stability in the country. And that's certainly something that the entire country, the entire region can rally around, hopefully with the EU playing a constructive, proactive role.
Good. I take back the role of moderator because we lost Dr. Nemat in the depth of the internet, but she sent me greetings, and I think she really also enjoyed the discussion. Let me conclude this on behalf of FAS and also APG, who ran this project, and thank you, Andrew and Timur, for this really great journey and the work. Kind of the peak today, but I'm sure we'll continue to have these discussions. To do the environmental scan with us. Again, we advertise these projects and products. If you have questions, I mean, you know how to find us on Facebook and Twitter. Reach out to us, also to Dr. Nemat. We like to be engaged. We see this as the beginning of a discussion, and every of these like 3-page briefs could have easily been a 300-page book if we had the time, but really opened only a small door, but just the questions and the discussion that we had show us that there's much more to discover. And this is also something that we plan to do in the future. For us, we both continue to have an open eye on what the European Union can do, maybe a realistic eye. Last developments are not yet making us so positive that the EU will come in as the savior and fill the vacuum. I think that's not going to happen, but we can look for creativity in the middle to find a role that is constructive. We also going to look further in further projects on the quest for the ideal platform that can also do the technical job in actually facilitating the dialogue that's much needed and consensus. And on the bilateral regional engagements, questions were mentioned, we took notes, and we'll certainly follow up on this. So thank you for everyone for taking the time to join us for discussing, raising questions. Thank you for the authors for the hard work. Now the hard work to read is on you, and let us know what you think. Our distinguished guests have moved on, and so everybody, especially on the Kabul side of this discussion, should move on direction of their much well-deserved iftar. And everybody on the line, stay safe, stay engaged with us, and keep some of the positive notes that we heard, especially in the beginning of this, in mind, and keep engaged with us. I wish you a nice afternoon and evening. To our transatlantic colleagues, have a great day, and we'll talk soon with all of you. Bye-bye. Thank you.